Okay, so we found a property that we like, mortgage broker has given the thumbs up, we've done our analysis, and now we're ready to put in an offer. Let's see how that works. Okay, so before we put pen to paper, what we want to do is get a better sense of where the seller's head's at. What are their goals? What are their motivations? The only piece of information we really have is what their asking price is. But let's see if we can find out a little bit more. I divide it into 4 sections and I call the other agent or the seller, if I can get the seller, and we go through each 4 of these. First one is price. Now that might sound a little bit funny, but price isn't necessarily the most important thing to the seller. They could have some other goals. For example, let's pretend somebody is selling this smaller building that we're interested in, and they're moving to a much larger, much more profitable project that they've got tied up. They want the small building sold. So if we can offer them a quick closing, strong buyer covenant that we're going to talk about in a second, we might be able to get some concession on price. Conversely, if somebody's selling a building because they're retiring, they probably don't care about anything aside from price. You want to close in 2 years? Great. You want to close in 2 weeks? Great. That's the price you're paying. Okay. Second thing is getting a sense of timelines. Typically what this really is about is closing date. So we remember the previous example, we're selling the small building, we're going into the big building. They want a tight, quick close. Conversely, somebody may be selling their second or third building of the year. They're going to have a capital gains issue. So if we're able to say to them, like, look, we're perfectly fine closing in 6 months, in 9 months, in a year, we don't care. We may ask for some concession though on price. How do you feel about that? Timelines, again, when do you want to close? Third thing, terms and conditions. Now, this is a preliminary conversation. We're not negotiating here. But what we do want to do is give them in broad strokes, here's where we're coming from. So you know the lender is going to, for example, want a phase 1. We're going to be asking for a building condition report. We do intend to send somebody up on the roof. Are you going to have a problem with this? Where are your thoughts in terms of conditions, right? So it's a discussion and it's going to inform how we're going to present the offer that we're going to see in a moment. Fourth one is get a sense of how important buyer's covenant is to the seller. Now we'll back up for a second here. Buyer's covenant is the word that we use for trust. Buyer covenant is how much or how well do we trust that the buyer is going to be able to get through due diligence successfully and in a timely fashion, and how much do we trust that they can and will be able to close when it comes time for closing. In the event that we don't have that trust, we may have a bit of a problem. I've had a building that I had to sell 3 times because my seller was not listening and just looking only at price. So we sold it the one time in competition. They beat out a lower offer that 100% would have closed on it. And the expensive guys did not get through due diligence. They couldn't get financing. We sold it again. Again, there were two offers at this point. There was one guy who was significantly higher. The deposit check didn't show up. Back it goes on the market. Long story short, we ended up selling that building for less money than the second place that was in the first round of offers. So covenant is important. If we have done our preparation, we know who our lender is, the lender is signed off, the environmental, the consultants, everybody's set and ready to go. We've got a track record of having purchased without issue. That is worth something to you, Mr. Seller. And we may be asking for a little bit of concession on price. Okay, so now it's time to put the offer together. You want to think of the offer in 2 parts. One is the standard mandatory fields, and the second part, called Schedule A, is the discretionary terms that apply more to you, the buyer, the seller, and this building. First part, mandatory fields, no matter the building or who you are, it's all got to be filled in. Second part, we get to tailor and change. Let's take a look at some elements of the first part. Okay, so up on the screen, we have, and for those of you who have done any residential, it's the exact same thing, this part. So who's the buyer, who's the seller, what's the address, what's the legal description? We know what we're buying, we know from whom we're purchasing, and we know who's buying, all right? A little bit further down and up on the screen here, we have to have a purchase price for all deals. We have to have a deposit, and we have to have an irrevocability, all right? So we're gonna give you 2 or 3 business days to think about this and get back to us, and we have to have a completion date. The only thing I would add in this is the deposits. So in the residential market, typically it is a deposit and it is given when the deal is accepted, usually. On this side, you can sometimes have a series of deposits. So here's the offer and $100,000. We're gonna get through our due diligence in 30 or 60 days. At the end of that period, if we are successful, we will give you an additional $100,000. So seller has $200,000, 100 and 100. Anyway, moot point, but just of note. Next in the mandatory fields, chattels, fixtures, and rental items. So for those of you who don't know, chattels and fixtures, the difference is, think about it this way. You're gonna take your building, you're gonna turn it upside down and give it a shake. Everything that falls is a chattel, and it goes with the property, right? The buyer doesn't get it. Anything that doesn't fall is affixed to the property and is deemed to stay with the property, so the buyer gets it, unless you specify otherwise. Number 4, chattels that we've got. Let's pretend the seller says in the marketing, hi, we've got 12 washers and 12 dryers for this 12-unit building. Those are chattels, right? So we put them in here. In the event that we do not put them in here, the seller could very well walk away with the 12 washers and dryers. Fixtures excluded, typically, and in fact, I'm trying to scratch my head for any time I've not had this. Fixtures excluded, I usually just write in tenant's possessions. So if the tenant has put up a fancy mirror in the bathroom or something, that belongs to the tenant. It's a fixture, so strictly speaking, it should go and be the property of the buyer. But we've said no, if it's a tenant's possession, they get to keep it. Rental items, we want to know what they are and how much they are. Do you own your hot water heaters? Do you own your coin washers and dryers? Are there any rentals that we need to know about? Next point that I want to bring up, now this is not a field, it is on the residential side. So if, for those of you who have done a deal recently, you will see HST is included or excluded from the purchase price, and the person drawing up the offer needs to choose one of those two. On the commercial side of things, HST is always deemed to be in addition to the purchase price when applicable. All right, so what does that mean? If you're buying a brand new building that's never been tenanted, there is going to be an HST question there. If you are buying a triplex, it's been a triplex for the last 20 years, it's resale, right? Just same as your house, no HST. It gets a little bit tricky though in some instances. Let's imagine a scenario where you've got the second, third, fourth, fifth story that are all apartment buildings, but the first story has a dry cleaner and a corner store in it. That first floor is 100% commercial. It's not residential resale. So there'll be an HST attached to that value of the commercial, but the rest of it is not, okay? So again, question for your accountant, and not to get too far into the weeds here, but do understand there is a difference on the commercial side as opposed to the residential side. Next, last page of the mandatory are the signatures. So you're going to draft this, I'm drafting this offer, I'm sending it to you, you're going to get it, you're going to sign the top, right? 29, just under there. We're then going to present it to the other side. In the event that the other side wants to do some changes, we offer $1 million, they want $1.1 million. They're going to sign on the second block of signatures, get it back to us. We're going to go back and forth, and let's pretend they send it to us. We're now in receipt, and we've agreed on $1.05 million. Okay, so we're all agreed. At that point, you, or the last person to receive the offer, are going to sign the confirmation of acceptance at the bottom. All right, so it's going to be, 3 p.m. this third day of June 2000 and whatever. Okay, so that's the end of the mandatory fields, the first section of the APS. Now let's take a look at the Schedule A. So a reminder, Schedule A is the opportunity to craft the offer that is going to be tailored to you, to the seller, and the specific building that we're buying. There are a number of standard clauses that we use on the commercial side. So we're going to go through a few of those right now, just so you can get a sense of what's going on. First one up on the screen is the conditional period for due diligence. Looking back at the residential side, you are no doubt familiar, you're going to have a finance clause for 5 days. You're going to have an inspection clause for, say, 7 days. You might have a clause for getting insurance. You're going to have all these individual clauses. On this side of the table, what we typically do is lump them all into one called due diligence. So let's take a look at this. This offer is conditional, okay, that's a condition. This offer is conditional upon the buyer's performance of any and all due diligence the buyer deems necessary, including but not limited to inspection of the building, review of leases, expenses and other documents, matters financial, matters environmental, insurance. Okay, so let's stop there. This is basically saying, well, it's not basically, it is saying any and all due diligence. So you want to check something, you get to check it. All right, so it's not just limited to what we've listed here. It's any and all due diligence that you feel important. You want to check the roof, you check the roof. You want to check the basement, you check the basement. You want to check the leases, you check the leases. Okay, you understand. Then it goes on to say, and the finding of said satisfactory to the buyer in the buyer's sole and absolute discretion. All right, so you're going to do these checks. You need to be satisfied. What qualifies as satisfied? It's entirely up to you. Your sole and absolute discretion. Now, we need to be a little bit careful here. If you tie up a property for 60 days, you've got a clause like this, and you tell the seller, which you would not do, but if you do, tell the seller that, yeah, we don't like the fact that the grass is green. Well, there's an argument there that you weren't really acting in good faith. So we've got to be a little bit careful here. But in essence, you do checks, it's got to satisfy you and your sole and absolute discretion. It goes on to read, unless the buyer gives notice in writing delivered to the seller personally, or in accordance with any provision for delivery of notice in this agreement of purchase and sale, me, or any schedule thereto, not later than 5 p.m. 45 days from acceptance. Okay, let's stop here. So on the residential, for those of you on the residential side, you have 5 days or 7 days, maybe you have 10 days. There's a lot more to check on this side of the table, so we need a lot more time, all right? So that's why 45, 60 days, it's not uncommon. Sellers want to have that as tight as possible, but they also want to make sure that you're going to be able to close at the end of it, right? So there's going to be a balance there. All right, so 45 days from acceptance that this condition is fulfilled, this offer shall be null and void, and the deposit shall be returned to the buyer in full without deduction. So in English, you've said, we're going to check stuff. We're going to need 45 days. At the end of that 45 days, I will or I will not be satisfied with the fruit of the due diligence. In the event that I am satisfied, I'm going to give you a piece of paper called a fulfillment, notice of fulfillment, sorry. That means the deal is now firm and binding in this instance, and we're going to go off to close. In the event that I am not satisfied, I've got a problem with the building that I just discovered through my due diligence, I'm not going to give you that piece of paper. And if I don't give you that piece of paper, the deal is dead, I get my deposit back in full without deduction. Final part, this condition is included for the benefit of the buyer and may be waived at the buyer's sole option by notice in writing to the seller, as aforesaid, within the time period, the 45 days stated therein. Okay, so what this is contemplating is the difference between a fulfillment and a waiver. Sometimes you don't even see that last sentence. The difference between those two is as follows. We have a conditional period. You will or you will not choose to actually do the checks. You will or will not actually look at the leases. It's a condition, but you've either done it or you haven't done it. If you've done it and you're satisfied, you have fulfilled the condition. In the event that you just go, it's going to be fine, you are now waiving it. It's a small who cares kind of point, but I just bring it up. That's the difference between a fulfillment and a waiver. Either way, if the seller gets a notice of fulfillment or a waiver, you're firm. You're now buying the building. Next, the seller agrees to provide the buyer who agrees to provide the seller with a reasonable notice, unfettered access to the property during the due diligence period. Okay, so in English, you know we're buying this with a condition of 45 days. We've got any and all due diligence. So if we want to check the roof, we're going to check it. You are going to give us unfettered access to the building, meaning you can't say to us, oh, I'm sorry, you can't go up on the roof. Or no, you can't see these units because we don't want to disturb these tenants. We get unfettered access to the building. It's common sense, but we're just putting it in writing here, all right? The only thing that the buyer is agreeing to is we're going to give you reasonable notice. So for example, if we want to see the units, and we're going to see all of the units, right? We need to understand that, okay, well, it's a minimum of 24 hours notice. Property manager, the landlord has to give that, so perhaps we'll give you 2 days or 3 days notice, right? Reasonable notice from us, but we get unfettered access to the building. Next, tenant acknowledgements. This is important. The seller agrees to provide tenant acknowledgements from each tenant whose form will be provided by the buyer not less than 5 days from the removal of all conditions. In the event that the seller is unable to secure a signed tenant acknowledgement from any given tenant, the seller may sign on behalf of said tenant and agrees to warrant the terms thereof. Okay, what's a tenant acknowledgement? Let's look at it this way. I'm buying the building from you. You have said that the rent is $1,500 a month for this unit. You've given me a lease. I see a rent roll. Okay, these two match. That's great. That's coming from you. But what about the tenant? Tenant may say, hey, look, yeah, the lease says $1,500, but the washing machine broke, so I've got a crappier washing machine, and the landlord said I only have to pay $1,400, so I'm only paying $1,400, right? Or another one, this does pop up every once in a while. The lease says it's an additional $50 for parking, but the landlord has never collected it, and the tenant is not going to pay it. So you've got a lease saying, $50 a month, tenant isn't paying. So it's an opportunity to let the tenant say, yes, I agree to these terms, right? And it's a little bit more than that as well. But nonetheless, I'm the buyer. I'm going to give you the tenant acknowledgement and the questions that I want answered, and you're going to get all the tenants to sign these and get them back to me within those 5 days. Now, last part, what happens if a tenant's on vacation, in the hospital? I don't know, it happens where you're just not able to get a tenant acknowledgement, signed from a tenant. Well, in that event, the landlord may sign on behalf of the tenant. If there is any dispute, the landlord warrants, we can seek damages, that the terms on that tenant acknowledgement are accurate, okay? So that's a tenant acknowledgement. Your banks are gonna want it, your lawyers are gonna want it, so tenant acknowledgements. All right, so an assignment clause, very typical. Often in the, and we should have gone over this in the beginning, but in that first section where we're putting down the buyer's name, it may often read Terry Riddoch or corporation to be formed. That's who's purchasing. Well, who's this corporation? Well, this is where this assignment comes in. Let's take a look. The buyer shall have the right anytime prior to closing to assign the within offer to any person, persons, or corporation, either existing or to be incorporated. And upon delivery to the seller of notice of such assignment, that's going to be the two lawyers talking to each other, by the way, together with the assignee's covenant in favor of the seller to be bound hereby as buyer, the buyer herein before named shall not stand released from all further liability hereunder. Okay, in English, I'm Terry Riddoch, I'm buying the building from you. I'm going to use my name for the purposes of just negotiating back and forth. Okay, that's done. However, my lawyer or my accountant has said to me, whenever you buy a building, you form a separate corporation, and that corporation is actually going to own the building. So you and I have done the deal together in my name and your name, but I have no intent of it closing under my name. We're going to have this corporation. You are permitting me to do so, all right? So I get to assign this deal to somebody else. Now, an important thing to understand, that is typically why we have an assignment clause. But there are some people out there who will purchase buildings with an assignment clause, and they have no intention of actually owning the corporation or being anywhere near involved with the actual entity that's going to end up closing on this. So I buy the building from you for $100. but I know I've got a sucker out there who will pay 120 bucks for it. So I've got the building tied up, I have this assignment clause, and I come up to the sucker and I do a deal with him for that 120, and he has to close, right? So I'm gonna get 20 bucks, you're gonna get your 100. What happens if he can't close? Well, the last line says, buyer herein before named shall not stand released. So if the sucker doesn't close, right, and you're not getting your 100 bucks on closing, I'm ponying up. I have to pony up for that 100, okay? So the assignment 99 times out of 100 is for that tax purpose, or however you're gonna, just the way the buyer wants to structure his ownership. That's when it's used. The last part though is in the event that there's a hiccup, I'm still on the hook because I was the original buyer. Okay, next one is the landlord. You are not allowed to do any changes, enter into any contracts, tenancies, or anything at all. Leave the building alone. So let's take a look. From the date of acceptance, the seller agrees not to enter into any new service, maintenance, or equipment rental contracts, tenancy agreements, or alter the terms of any tenancy agreements without the permission of the buyer. So you recall, we've got our due diligence period. We're going to be asking for all the leases, rental contracts, everything like that. And we're going to make our decision of whether or not we want to proceed based on those documents. So you, the landlord, are not allowed to come up to the tenants and going, hey, great news, everybody's 500 bucks a month off in rent. Or if a unit comes up vacant, you're not allowed to rent it out without our permission because we want to know who the tenants are. We may feel that your rents are too low. Service contracts. We're basing this offer on the fact that garbage costs this much, snow costs this much, yada, yada, yada. So don't change those, all right, unless we give you permission. Okay, so that's an important one and a standard one in these offers. Okay, so that in a nutshell is how you put an offer together. From here, it's quite simple. It goes to you, you sign it, I give it to the other side, and we start negotiating. All right, so if you have, as always, if you've got any questions or are interested in some properties, I'd love to hear from you. Cell phone, email in the description below. Thank you for watching, and we'll talk soon.